very quick change of slides. We're ready to go. It's nice when technology cooperates. It's a great pleasure to be here for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be in Greece. I mean, we can just start and end there. But it's especially a great pleasure to be here speaking primarily to clinicians. I know there's some other folks in the audience, and I'm going to make it user-friendly enough that even if you're an adult with ADHD and you're not a clinician of any kind, there'll still be a lot of strategies that you'll be able to walk away with. You'll have a better understanding of how ADHD works, either in your life or the life of someone you care about. But I always prefer, in some ways, to speak with clinicians or teachers or other people who, when you educate that one person, the effect multiplies out to many more people. I love doing presentations for the public, and I do a lot of those also, but if for every audience member in a presentation for the public, maybe they tell a few people, or maybe they have a few people in their family, but that's sort of where it ends. But one clinician, you can affect 10, 20, even 100 people over the course of some years. So it's a much more efficient way to really get that good information out there. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm glad that you guys are here as well. So I'd like to thank all the people who put this together. The way these things usually go is there's a small number of people doing a large amount of work. So I want to thank Niobe for bringing me out here, all the folks at DEREE for doing what they did to spread the word and offer us a space, ADHD Hellas for the work that you guys do, which is really important work. And I definitely, I'm a big supporter of CHAD, which is the American ADHD group, and the work that you guys do. You do a lot of work with a whole lot less thanks and attention for what you're doing, so I think these organizations are very important. So, as Niobe said, we're going to be here a while. If you need to use the bathroom, it's right over there, feel free. If you need to just walk around, don't feel like you have to pretend to use the bathroom. If you want to just walk in the back, feel free. So, but let's take a look at an email. Now, I got this email, I don't know, 2005, so I've been using it for a while. But I could have replaced this email 20 times or 30 times. So the only thing that's really unique about this email is that I happened to get it at the time that I was putting together slides for a presentation. So I've kept it. But what's great about this is, in 2 paragraphs, this woman hits everything that we're going to cover today. She tells you everything you need to know about ADHD. So let's take a look. I was diagnosed with ADD last year. So ADHD, ADD, technically the right term is ADHD, but they're really used interchangeably. So when you talk about one, you're really talking about both. But she was diagnosed last year. Now, she's an adult. I don't know exactly how old she is, but I'm going to guess she's at least 30, maybe 40, maybe 50. She's not 18. She's not a kid or a teen who just got diagnosed. She's an adult who just got diagnosed. And for most adults, if you're over 30 years old, you're probably not diagnosed as a kid because it just wasn't being diagnosed at that time. I've suffered from various symptoms since childhood. Yeah, ADHD by definition is lifelong. It's always been there. Now granted, life as a 10-year-old looks different than life as a 40-year-old, so it shows up a little differently, but it's always been there. I often find myself not being able to handle the pressure of life. Just getting simple things done, and I'm single with no kids. It's making her life harder. ADD has long affected my relationships, my work habits, my finances, etc. ADHD affects every part of a person's life. It's not just about school. It is about school, and when we're talking about kids, then obviously school is most of what kids do. But she's not talking about school. She's not talking about, the literature class I had this semester in college. She's talking about more adult matters. I'm now at the point where I really can't deal with it any longer. So she's finally getting to a point where she's looking for some help. Or at least she is, again, getting to a point that she's looking for some help. Last year after my diagnosis, I refused to take my meds. Not an uncommon situation. And this just perpetuates the problem. Well, of course, if you don't address it, things just stay the same. My anxiety level is extremely high, and I get to the point where I want to shut myself off from society, which is where I am now. So she's anxious and she's depressed. ADHD has an extremely high level of comorbidity. So especially when you're talking about adults, other conditions are beginning to show up because their life has been harder. My doctor retired last winter and I'm looking for someone new. Please let me know if you're accepting new patients. Adults with ADHD are looking for clinicians. And not just any clinician, but looking for clinicians who know how to be helpful to them. I get emails on a regular basis, because I've written books and because I do presentations and I do teleclasses where people can be listening really from anywhere in the world. I get people emailing me from across the country. I even get people emailing me from outside of the country asking, do you know anyone who does the kind of work that you do here in, and then name a town that maybe I've heard of or maybe I haven't. And the fact that they're emailing someone from 500 miles away, 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away, that tells us they're not finding anybody locally. If you can easily find someone locally, you don't have to take a long shot on emailing some guy from 1,000 miles away. Because what are the odds that I do know someone there? Although weirdly enough, often I do. It's kind of crazy, but ADHD is a small world. So this is what we're going to talk about. And my goal is to give you a deeper understanding of ADHD so you understand in a more fundamental way what exactly is involved in ADHD. Not just the obvious stuff, but the bigger stuff. And then from that to give you practical strategies that you can use with your next client on Monday. So it's not just about theory. I'm a clinician, like Niobe said. I spend all day working with clients. My job is to make people's lives better, as your jobs are to make people's lives better. So the theory is important, but only to the extent that it helps you make people's lives better. So for a lot of adults with ADHD, they've gone through life with people making a lot of suggestions. Often well-meaning, but not always so well-meaning. But they get a lot of suggestions. Sometimes it helps, often it doesn't. So what you get a lot of is things like, oh, you have trouble getting places on time? You should leave earlier, kind of advice. As if that was the very first time this person has ever heard that, and now their problem is solved. If it was that easy, it wouldn't be a problem, right? By definition, if they were 30 years old and still running late, leaving earlier is not the solution to the problem. So our job as clinicians, especially with clients who've seen more than one person before they've seen us, that we're probably not the first person they've seen. Part of our job is to give them a legitimate sense of optimism that indeed things can be better. And better than what other clinicians have been able to do for them. The reason why we can make that promise, not guarantees, but we can at least make a promise, is by really understanding ADHD and by specifically addressing their ADHD. That is what will enable us to be more helpful to them than the people they've seen before. So, as Niobe said, not looking at their ADHD symptoms through the lens of, repressed conflicts, family dynamics, personality dynamics, or other things of that sort. Now granted, people with ADHD have all the same neurotic, kind of crazy stuff that everybody has. Everybody has that to some extent. So it's not that people with ADHD don't have their neurotic issues. It's just that the neurotic issues don't explain everything of what's going on. And we really need to address both sides of it. The ADHD executive function, information processing side, and also the dynamic aspects. And just one is not enough. So I sometimes get clinicians, other clinicians in the States, other clinicians I come across, who say, we're talking, so who do you work with, and what kind of clients do you like to see, and all of that. And some of them will say, oh, you see adults with ADHD? Yeah, I don't really see a lot of adults with ADHD. And usually I have enough of a filter that I don't say, this is what I think, but I don't come right out and say it. What I think is, No, you do actually see adults with ADHD. You don't know it, and you're not really addressing their ADHD, and ultimately you're going to be far less helpful to them than you or they would like you to be. But you are seeing adults with ADHD. And the reason is, adults with ADHD are overrepresented in the clinical population. So if we pull 1,000 people off the street, randomly, 1,000 people off the street, 4 or 5%, roughly, will have ADHD. But then we look at the percentage that's found in the clinical population. So in other words, the people who come to see us. And most of them do not say, I have ADHD, can you help me? What they say is, I'm fighting a lot with my wife or with my boyfriend, I'm not doing well in school, I'm not doing well at work, my life is kind of a mess, it's not working out. That's what they say. A small number will say, I have ADHD. But most of them say this other stuff. Because of course that's what they care about. They care about the fact that they're fighting with their wife. They care about the fact that they're not doing as well at work as they know they should. But there's a study done where they did this big survey of a bunch of adults and looked at the ones who are being treated for some other condition. And then of those, they looked at what percentage of them also have ADHD. Maybe not identified by the clinician they were seeing, but identified by the people in the study. So what they found was, for example, major depression, 9.4% of those being treated for major depression also had ADHD. 4 to 5% of the general population, this is double that. If you're seeing someone with major depression, there's a 10% chance that they have ADHD. Or for dysthymia, it's 1 out of 4 or 5. Bipolar, 1 out of 5. Generalized anxiety disorder, 1 out of 10. Active substance abuse, 1 out of 10. These are some big numbers. If you think of a standard caseload as being 20 or 30 clients, that means low number, you have 2 or 3 adults with ADHD. Depending on what your other diagnoses are, you know, if it's 1 out of 4 for dysthymia, or 1 out of 5, we'll use the smaller number. 1 out of 5. If you see 30 clients, 6 of them are adults with ADHD. Everybody you see on Tuesday is adults with ADHD. Is that a small number? Not at all. We should also point out that the fact that adults with ADHD have more of these troubles, what does that tell you about the effect that their ADHD is having on their life? So when we talk about the effects of ADHD, here's where we're seeing it. So in terms of the statistics about ADHD in adults, or kids and teens, there's a lot of statistics that show the effects of ADHD on every part of a person's life. And for the most part, it's not pretty. Now, the statistics, of course, statistics are always at the group level. But individuals, obviously every individual exists in their own life. There are many adults with ADHD who are extremely successful. So it doesn't mean that ADHD is a death sentence by any means. But when you look at the group level, you can see it is making their lives harder. So if you look at school, kids with ADHD are more likely to have lower grades. They're more likely to be held back a grade. They're more likely to get detention where they have to stay after school, or to be suspended or even expelled. So the hyperactive impulsive symptoms make them more likely to run into big trouble like that. In the world of work, adults with ADHD make less money per year, all other things being equal, than adults without ADHD. And one of the reasons for that is that adults with ADHD are more likely to impulsively quit a job. If you quit a job, you don't stick around long enough. You get bored of a job, you don't stick around long enough. You don't work your way up the ladder and up the pay scale. In terms of relationships, couples where one person has ADHD tend to have a lower marital satisfaction, more divorces, more unplanned pregnancies, earlier sexual encounters for teenagers. Daily life management. Adults with ADHD have lower credit scores. You guys have credit scores here in Greece? So basically how they tend to pay their bills late. They tend to miss payments, not because they don't have the money, but because they lose the bill or they forget to send it in on time. And then psychological functioning, like we talked about, greater anxiety, depression, substance abuse. When you put all of this together, ADHD has been found to be one of the most disabling of all the mental health diagnoses. So it's not a small thing. This is a big thing. And this is where the statistics come from, or this is one of the places. So Russell Barkley, Kevin Murphy, Mary Ellen Fisher. This is about 400 pages, and there's about 600 graphs and charts. If you like statistics, this is totally the book for you, because there is so many statistics. So it's not an easy book to read, and you don't necessarily read it from start to finish unless you're writing a book, and then you have to read it. But there's a ton of statistics in here that talk about the effect of ADHD on adults. Now, there's a lot of theories out there about what causes ADHD. Or why are we seeing more ADHD now, seemingly, than we did 20 years ago? In other words, where's all this ADHD coming from? It's important to note, though, that just because something affects attention does not mean that it's causing ADHD. For example, if you have the flu, your attention is much worse, but you don't say, man, did I have a bad case of ADHD last week, but I'm feeling much better now. Sleep deprivation will also affect your attention. But again, you don't say, boy, I have really bad ADHD today, I better get to bed early. So a lot of the things that are claimed to affect or to drive ADHD, they don't really, but they're just affecting something else that looks a little bit like ADHD, at least on the surface. So one of the most popular of these unsupported theories are things related to diet or food additives or allergies or whatever. There's a small percentage of people who really do have some sort of food sensitivity or an allergy or whatever. And I'm definitely not endorsing all the colorings and the preservatives and the junk that's showing up in food these days. But that's not causing ADHD. If you have a food sensitivity that causes you to be less focused, your problem is a food sensitivity. It's not ADHD. The big proponent of this was someone named Feingold, or the Feingold diet, that makes these claims. Bad parenting does not cause ADHD. It goes the other way. Kids with ADHD cause bad parenting. Right? Any kid who's more difficult to manage will evoke more negative responses from parents. They've done studies where you treat the kid with ADHD and the parents parent better. You're not treating the parent, you're treating the kid. So you change this and that gets better, tells us the direction the causality goes. Also, the rapid pace of modern life is not causing ADHD. Video games don't cause ADHD. But all of this busy, overstimulating, distracting world we live in, if you have ADHD, it will make it more obvious. There's definitely, when we talk about what is causing ADHD, genetics is a big part of it. It's about 80% genetic, meaning if somebody has ADHD, there's an 80% chance that it's genetics that's causing it. And about 20% that it's other things. So like, if you find one person in a family with ADHD, there's a good chance you're finding somebody else. So if you look at parents, siblings, and kids, you share half your genes with each of these people. So about 1 in 4 of them will have ADHD, if you find one person with ADHD. That's a little bit of a low number. Some studies find things like 40%. So if a parent has ADHD, 40% chance each of the kids has ADHD. In terms of why that is, or what's the mechanism, is primarily related to genes involved with dopamine receptors. And I think there's 6 or 8 genes that have been identified so far. So it's not a simple, like, one gene, ta-da, you have ADHD. It's the combination of multiple genes involved in these receptors. At the moment, though, there's no place for genetic testing because it's just not good enough to do it. So what we're talking about today is how to make a good diagnosis of ADHD. We're going to talk about the executive functions because ADHD is really executive functions. To understand ADHD, you have to understand the executive functions. And what the executive functions are is they're information processing mechanisms that our brains use that to sort of process the world around us, make good choices, manage complexity and distractions. And I'll talk about it at length. Then we're going to talk about a 4-part treatment model. Now, not everybody needs all 4 parts, and not everybody gets all 4 parts, but here's your menu of options. First part is education, meaning that the person with ADHD learns about ADHD, or the parent learns, or whatever, or the spouse, just learning about ADHD, what it is, and how it's affecting things in the person's life. Medication, we'll talk about as well. Coaching, meaning specific practical strategies. How do you keep track of things on your schedule? How do you set priorities? How do you organize your desk at work? Things like that. And then finally, we're going to talk about therapy. Therapy doesn't change ADHD, but having ADHD affects a person's psychology, how they see themselves, how they see other people in relationships, how they approach challenges. So there's a lot of therapy to be done there as well. So all these pieces fit together, and no one piece is enough all by itself, typically. How's that sound? Okay, so diagnosis. The question is raised, the statement that's made by critics is, 30 years ago nobody had ADHD. Why does everybody now have ADHD? Which makes it sound, fake. But here's the thing. I can think of at least one kid, this guy Chris, who lived behind me, who was in my grade. I will bet you $1 million that that guy has ADHD. It was never, I assume, it was never identified as when he was a kid, because people weren't talking about it when we were kids. But I will bet you $1 million if we interviewed him today, he has ADHD. So it was there, it just wasn't talked about. And there have even been historical records going back to, I think now they found some new stuff like the 1700s, talking, describing symptoms that sound an awful lot like ADHD. So it's not like it's brand new, it's just that the world is more complex, there's more distractions, time is tighter now than it used to be, and that makes ADHD more obvious. It's possible that there is something in our environment that's increasing the amount of ADHD, but thus far it has not been identified. There's been no clear connection between this and increased ADHD. Doesn't mean that there won't be, but as of yet, there's nothing that really seems like a likely possibility. So, one of the things that makes it harder to diagnose ADHD is that we all have our moments. The symptoms of ADHD occur on the kind of normal spectrum of behavior. Everybody's distractible sometimes. Everybody forgets things sometimes. Everybody does something that, in retrospect, they kind of wish they hadn't done. So it's not a matter of, someone has ADHD or someone has a symptom or they don't have it. It's a matter of how much do they have it. So for example, the example I use, and this is probably not entirely accurate, but it's sort of like schizophrenia. If someone is having paranoid delusions in schizophrenia, we don't say, well, I have some paranoid delusions, but not a lot. Like, I don't think everyone is trying to kill me. I just think a couple people are trying to kill me. So, whatever, it's not a big deal, right? It's more like you have it or you don't have it. But ADHD is not that simple. Everyone has it to some degree. So that's where it feels a little bit more fuzzy, and that's where the critics can say, oh, you're just making things, kids will be kids, whatever, or that adult, he's just not trying, or something. So, unfortunately, it makes it easy to discount it if you choose to not be educated. Now, if you look at the details and you look at the science, it's a lot harder to dispute it. So, and we'll talk about why that is. But part of the problem here is, if you have an adult with ADHD who is perhaps also anxious or also depressed or has certain psychological dynamics as a result of their ADHD symptoms, how do you know what's what? Is it simply ADHD? Is it simply anxiety? Or is it both? And that's where it takes a bit of time and some skill to figure that out. Now, it's possible to make a mistake both ways when we're making a diagnosis. So false positive means we say, yes, you have this diagnosis, when in fact the person doesn't. So it's easy to make an incorrect self-diagnosis if you're doing a rating scale, especially if it's something online or something in some magazine, where it's like, oh, I forget things sometimes, check. Yeah, sometimes in boring meetings I can't pay attention, check. You know, so it's kind of like everyone can endorse it at least sometimes. So that's one way to have too many people getting a diagnosis of ADHD. Or, you know, someone says, oh, doesn't achieve to potential. Yeah, I never did well in school. Oh, I'm not doing well in work. I should be the president of this company, but instead I'm only sweeping the floors. I must have ADHD because that's what's holding me back from becoming president of the company. Maybe it is, but you know, there's about 1,000 other reasons why someone isn't doing well, including completely psychodynamic reasons. So if someone is having these struggles, ADHD is not the only possible reason why. So that's one option, one possibility. False negatives is the other side of it, where we say, no, this doesn't sound like ADHD, when in fact the person does have ADHD. So there's a number of reasons why that could be. One of them is, it's not on the clinician's radar screen. If you don't look for something, you can't find it. And you know, Niobe said this, that until 5 years ago, she wasn't looking for it, she didn't find it. None of us, you know, it's just one of those things. You can't find what you don't look for. If you don't think of ADHD as possible for adults, it will never come to you and say, oh, I think this sounds an awful lot like ADHD. Or inappropriate measures were used. So, you know, I can't tell you how often I hear this, where someone, either a client or someone emails me or someone at a presentation says, yeah, you know, I was talking to my doctor or my psychologist or whatever, and they said, well, can you pay attention to video games or things that you find really interesting? The person says, yes. I say, okay, well then it's not ADHD. If you can't pay attention to something you're really interested in, that doesn't mean ADHD, that means you have a brain injury or something, right? So ADHD doesn't mean no attention. ADHD means inconsistent attention. Stuff that's interesting, no problem. It's the boring stuff. That's the hard part of ADHD. So these people who say, can you pay attention to video games? Yeah, okay, well then we're done. They're missing it. They don't get ADHD. Or alternatively, you know, for a lot of adults, or even kids or teens, if you have a parent with ADHD and perhaps a grandparent with ADHD, this is normal. What do you mean? I'm just like mom. Isn't everybody like that? Wait, your family gets places on time? Really? Come on. I've never seen that happen. So, you know, however you grow up, that's normal. So it creates this expectation of like, what do you mean? He's fine. He's just like me. I did okay. And of course to say, I think something's going on with your kid here, for some adults can feel like, you know, kind of an insult, or you're attacking their defenses. I'm doing fine. He is fine. We don't need to talk about this. And there's a lot of ego on the line when you get into that stuff. And I hate to say it, it is way more often the dads than it is the moms who get defensive. Not necessarily the dads who have ADHD more often, but they get defensive more often. So, when we talk about ADHD, there are 3 core symptoms. The first is inattention, and this involves trouble with organization, time management, forgetfulness, paying attention to things that are not incredibly interesting. Some people have, and then there's the hyperactive cluster of symptoms, which involves physical restlessness, so having trouble sitting still. But if you're hyperactive as a kid, you're probably a lot less hyperactive as an adult. That part fades away. And it used to be believed ADHD is just for kids, and then it disappears. Well, this disappears. So if Johnny is not running around anymore, because now he's 20, it's easy to say, oh, ta-da, problem solved. But it's not, because the inattention remains, the impulsivity remains, and this is what becomes more problematic in adulthood. Then the impulsivity is basically acting before thinking through the consequences. And this could be little things like buying, oh, grapes are on sale at the supermarket. Let's buy grapes. I know I came just for milk, but you know what? Let's buy grapes also. So that's not a big deal. But it could be other things like, I'm driving and that car's coming. I think I can make it. And maybe you do, hopefully, but maybe you don't. As much as, ADHD, attention deficit, it's not quite the right word. That it's not a deficit in attention per se, like we talked about. It's not that someone with ADHD has no attention or really poor attention. It's a deficit in attention regulation. And attention regulation means keeping your attention on something when you should, but also shifting when you should. And it's that flexibility that is important. That's what we're looking for. The ability to shift when it's the right thing to do, but stick when that's the right thing to do. So what's often, an example that's often given, again, by the dads, more than the moms, but is, if he can pay attention to Xbox, great. He doesn't have ADHD. But try to get him to do more than 2 pages of reading and forget it. He won't do it. And the funny thing is that, this is said in a way of, this ADHD stuff is nonsense. Ironically, that statement supports a diagnosis of ADHD. Because what it shows is inconsistent attention regulation. And the hyperfocus of, the classic example is the kid who's playing Xbox and you can fire a gun behind him and he won't hear it. That's a great example of bad attention regulation. Because ideally, when you're paying attention here on the thing you should be, there's a little bit of attention scanning back here that picks up when someone's calling your name, that you hear it. Where someone with ADHD gets absorbed into whatever they're doing and they don't monitor back here, they don't monitor the time, they don't think about what else they need to do. So, Barkley has said that ADHD is not a disorder of knowing what to do, it's a disorder of doing what you know. So in other words, people with ADHD don't need people to tell them things like, you should pay your bills on time, you should keep your stuff more organized, you should get places on time, you should pay attention to the boring teacher, you should remember whatever. They are very well aware of all of those things. But the knowing and the doing is not the same thing. And just for the sake of a broader statement here, anybody who's been on a diet knows the difference between knowing and doing. Or let's talk about flossing your teeth. Now if you ask the dentist, you're supposed to floss twice a day. Anybody here actually floss twice a day? All right, he wins the prize. Now we all know we should do it. Why don't we do it? So knowing is easy. It's the doing that's the hard part. What the executive functions enable us to do, and we're going to talk about them in detail, is to do what we know. So to take these ideas, these intentions, and turn them reliably into actions. Not once in a while, but regularly. If you show up to work on time once, your boss is not going to say, "That's great, thanks for showing up on time." And if they do say that, "Thanks for showing up on time," are they saying it in a nice way, or are they kind of saying something else? So when it comes to making a diagnosis of ADHD, as of this moment, still the best way is a good diagnostic interview. You bring the person in, you talk about, tell me about how things are going in your life. And what we're looking for is a clear and consistent pattern of inconsistent performance and underperformance. So it's that kid who, the teacher says, "Oh, she's so smart. If she just applied herself a little bit more, she could be getting much better grades." Or the adult who knows what to do, but somehow it's not quite coming together in a consistent sort of way, despite good effort and despite good intentions. Part of what you need to look for is not the times that someone forgets things, or when they don't do something that isn't really important to them. So if you have a 16-year-old who isn't doing their homework because he's, you know, talking to girls or something, maybe the girls are much more important than the homework. Now, his parents might feel differently about that, but for him, really, you know, the girls are what it's about. So that may be ADHD, but you know what, maybe it's not ADHD. So you need to look for the places where the person pays a price based on what's important to them. So if someone loses their cell phone on a regular basis, that's important to them. Having said that, some things like cell phones are sacred for some people, and they never lose them. They lose everything else in the world, they never lose their cell phone. So again, inconsistent, so maybe we'll put that one to the side. But what they do lose is other stuff, like you know, a child who's in a sport and is very interested in it, but they show up without everything they need, so they don't have all of their uniform with them. That hurts them. It doesn't hurt their parents, maybe it does, but it hurts the child themselves. Or the adult who has to pay a late fee because they sent a bill in late. That hurts them more than anybody else. So you look for those places where it's not just convenient that the person forgot. Oh darn, I forgot to do the dishes. I was really looking forward to that. Sorry honey, I guess you can do them. Right? That's a convenient thing. ADHD involves that the person themselves pays a price as well. So in order to do a better interview, a more accurate interview, there are a number of things that you can do. One of them is spend at least an hour. I do 2 hours. And even the 2 really becomes like 2 1/4 by the time I'm done. But spend enough time to really be able to look at not just the obvious stuff, but what are some of the other things going on? What are some of the other explanations for why this person isn't doing as well as they could? Because anytime we make a diagnosis and we say, yes, it sounds like this, at the same time we're also saying, no, it isn't these other things either. And that applies when you take your car to the garage. It's the same thing. They're saying, aha, the problem is this. It's not that. So they don't replace 15 other things that don't need fixing. They only replace the one part that's broken. So as clinicians, we do the same thing. We identify the parts that aren't working and we say, but it's not these other reasons instead. If at all possible, I always like to include a second person. In the case of kids, teens, and young adults, that's a parent, could also be a romantic partner, but I've had adults bring their parents. You know, so adults who are like 40, they bring their mom who's like 60 or 70. And that's always good. I love having the moms in. Because the moms remember our childhood. We don't remember our childhood. Our moms remember our childhood. And our dads too, but let's be honest, it's the moms who come more. And the reason why is I like to hear what the other person has to say. Not because they tell me something different, and not because they contradict what the other person says, but just it's nice to hear it twice, and it's nice to hear an extra layer of detail on top of what the person themselves is telling me. This is especially important if you're talking to teenagers or young adults, so adults in their 20s. If you ask them to report their ADHD symptoms, they tend to underreport it. That they think they're doing better in the world than other people think they're doing. Over time, as their brain continues to develop, they get greater insight into how they're doing, and they tend then the reporting of ADHD symptoms goes up over the course of their 20s. I don't think their ADHD is getting worse. I think their self-awareness is getting better. If they have them, it's nice to see old report cards or evaluations from work, so a written record, something that somebody else said about this person at different points in history. So if you see a consistent pattern through there, that suggests ADHD. If you don't see a consistent pattern there, maybe it's not ADHD. It's also good to ask non-leading questions. So in other words, you don't say things like, so do you have trouble running late? Yes, okay, check. Do you lose things? Yes, check. So ask broader questions. So things like, what about your room? Is it kind of organized? Is it sort of messy? Kind of, you know, what does your room look like? So you're not suggesting to them what the right answer is. Or when you have things to do, are you one of those people who kind of like does it early and gets it done? Do you sort of work steadily along the way? Or do you kind of do it all at the end? Like when you have things to do, how do you tend to approach it? So you're asking a question with multiple possibilities. But the ADHD answer is, oh no, I do it at the end. It all gets done at the end. But you're not suggesting that as the answer, so to speak. But also looking for subtle effects beyond the obvious. So you're not just going down the DSM checklist. It doesn't take you 2 hours to read the DSM checklist, right? 18 symptoms. That's about 14 minutes, ching, 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 done. So for example, one of the things that I'll sometimes ask, if someone has given me some indication of being hyperactive, I'll ask them, do you ever go to the movies? Like when you watch movies, you watch them at the movie theater or you watch them at home? Like what do you tend to do? Someone who has trouble sitting still will tend to say, I hate going to the movies. Movies are okay. If it's really good, it's a great movie, then I can go. But otherwise, I watch it at home, and I'm playing on the computer, or I'm knitting, or I'm flipping through a magazine, or I'm getting up and I go do other stuff. That's not in the DSM list. Doesn't watch movies in the movie theater. It's not in the DSM, and it never will be. But that's one of those little things that kind of suggests that, that this might be part of what's going on. Or another one, I once had a guy, actually I think I had 2 people say this, but I had a guy where I asked him, I said, so when you were a kid and you had homework to do, how did you do with kind of bringing home all the right books, having the right stuff with you? Like, were you pretty good with that, the stuff you left at school? Like, what happened? He said, oh no, I never ever left anything at school. Like, oh, not the answer I was expecting. I was like, well, so how did you do that? Well, every day I brought every single book home. Aha. So, again, not in the DSM checklist, but the fact that he had to do that he was bringing home books that he knew, I don't have math homework, but his math book is in there. I mean, he must have, first of all, been incredibly strong by the time the year was done, but that tells us something. Why did he need to do this thing that other kids did? And it tells us that he probably couldn't, he realized, that's the good awareness, he realized, I'm not good at remembering what books I need and what books I don't. So better safe than sorry, just bring everything. And of course, you're exploring alternative explanations. So this isn't ADHD, this is anxiety, this is a personality disorder, this is substance abuse. You're looking for other reasons as well. So in order to count towards a diagnosis of ADHD, 3 things need to be true. The symptom needs to be persistent, pervasive, and impairing. So persistent means present since childhood. It's always been there. Now, it looks a little different maybe over the years, because your life is different over the years, but it's always been there in one way or another. It has to be pervasive, meaning it occurs across multiple settings. So not just at school, but also at home, and also with your friends, and also at work. In this class, in this class, in this class. And last year, it was in this class, in this class, in this class. Maybe not this class, because that teacher is really interesting and dynamic and engaging and keeps kids involved. Or, this student loves, math class and is good at math, so it doesn't show up there, but it shows up in the other classes. So, it's showing up in multiple parts of the person's life. And finally, it has to be impairing. If it's not causing some suffering, then it's just annoying. And annoying doesn't mean ADHD. Annoying also doesn't mean anxiety. It also doesn't mean depression. Like, we all have our moments of, oh, I don't feel so good, or I wish that was better, or I'm worrying about this, but let me just put it aside. But ADHD means it's causing an effect on the person's life. And when we talk about that range of human behavior, if it's not causing problems, I mean, by definition, it's not a disorder. There has to be some impairment involved in a disorder. As a broad statement, other conditions show much more variability over time or across situations. ADHD is always there in one way or another. Whereas something like anxiety or depression or bipolar or substance abuse, there are times where it's more present and there are times where it's less present. Whereas ADHD is consistently, it's kind of like this. It's always there, always there, always there, always there. Now, you're also looking not just at the words the person says, but you're also looking at how do they say them. What's the tone of their presentation to you? So what you're looking for is some sort of a sense of long-standing pain. So it's not just, now they may be laughing and they may be kind of joking and sort of happy about it, but you can tell that it bothers them. And if they could have changed it, they would have changed it. And that it occurs despite good effort and despite good intentions. You may see some avoidance. So, you know, they get to a point in school where they kind of give up and they're not really trying and they're just like, whatever, I don't care. But that's not where it started. That's where it ended up, but that's not the cause originally of the difficulties that they were having. Now, you also will see sometimes, you know, like, kind of call it your ironic laughing, where you say things like, so how do you do keeping track of your stuff? And they laugh, or the other person laughs, or they look at each other and go, oh man, or something. And that tells you, okay, check. We can check that one off. You know, that they laugh about it because it's kind of become a joke for them. A painful joke, but a joke. You can also look at how does the person answer your question. So are they fidgeting around, which they might be doing if they're younger. If they're 30 or so, they're probably not fidgeting around anymore. But they ramble around, they forget the point, so they start telling you something and then they wind up somewhere and they say, wait a second, what did you ask me again? They interrupt you, so you start asking a question and before you get to the end, they start answering you. Which is fine if they read you correctly and they're actually answering the question they think you're going to ask. But sometimes when you interrupt, you answer not the question that's ultimately asked, but you answer a different question. So you're looking at that part of the interview as well, just as you would in other diagnostic interviews. So the DSM-4 is obviously our current standard. And it's okay, but it's not great. I was at the big CHAD conference, the National ADHD Conference, and I was talking to one of the guys who's on the DSM committee for the DSM-5 said, the DSM is very easy to criticize and really hard to improve. So it's easy to say, this is bad for all these reasons, but then how do you come up with something better? And just as one example, one suggestion was made that we have different criteria for adults and kids. That's great, except you want to, that with this weird situation where, let's say it's age 18. Under age 18, use the child criteria, 18 and over, use the adult criteria. So what it means is, when someone is 17 years old and 364 days, they don't have ADHD. And then one day later, now they do, because they fit the adult criteria. But at 17 they didn't, but tomorrow they do. What do you do with that? So what do we say? It's like roughly around 18? Like, what's the better solution? I don't know. So this is part of the problem. And unfortunately, DSM-5 is not going to be as good as we were hoping it was going to be. I don't think. That's what I'm hearing, is that it's not going to be. There are a lot of things suggested, improvements, and unfortunately it doesn't look like they're going to go through. Yeah?
I just also about hyperactivity, since we know that hyperactivity tends to get better now, what is the point of including that as part of the
right.
as part of the diagnosis for adults? It seems a bit meaningless.
And that's part of the problem. Is that, so the question is, why do we include hyperactivity in adults when it tends not to be present? I mean, one of the things you would do is you would look back, was this person hyperactive in childhood, and say, okay, well they were, so therefore that counts now for adulthood. But yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem, is that the DSM description is much better at describing what ADHD looks like in kids and not as good at describing what it looks like in adults. And partially it's because there's more, even on the hyperactivity and impulsivity side, you need 6 out of 9 criteria. 6 of them are about hyperactivity and 3 of them are about impulsivity. So we're clearly weighting it on the hyperactive side and not really on the impulsive side. part of, yeah.
Is hyperactivity goes away when you are an adult or just changing the form of
It fades down. It doesn't necessarily go away completely. So for example, someone who's 30, who used to be hyperactive as a kid, they're not running around, but they're not going to get a desk job where they have to sit for 8 or 9 hours a day. They would much rather do something where they're moving around a little bit more. So that's more what it looks like. If they have to sit, they can, but they get more of an internal sense of being restless and they don't enjoy it. It also, so the criteria, first, it says often fails to give close attention to details. What is often? Once a day, once a week, once a year? What does often mean? And what I think often means may not be what you think, and you think, like, we may have 30 interpretations of what often means. So it's a little too subjective. Hopefully DSM-5 tells us some more specifics about what that means. The other thing is that in the DSM-4, if you're going to be technical about it, the symptoms have to be present since age 7. That's what they say. Who can tell me give me one other condition that has a criteria like this? What's some of the other conditions that say by age 7? Trick question. There are no other diagnoses that require the symptoms have been present since age 7. What in the world is this doing here? Someone stuck it in at the last minute, and we've been stuck with it ever since. So I don't use the DSM. I don't stick tight to the DSM and say, oh man, you have 5 out of 9. Oh well, sorry, that's not ADHD. So unfortunately, you need to be a little bit loose about it if you're really going to be accurate.
Could it be because ADHD is always present? So if you don't have it at a young age, you most likely don't have it at an adult age. So let's have a point of reference that at least you have it at the age of 7. That would make sense.
Right. And hopefully what they're going to do is they're going to move that 7 up to like 13 or 16.
So it's
because if you're really hyperactive, you'll see that before age 7. But if you're just inattentive, how much attention do you expect out of a 6-year-old? So can we show that you're clearly having trouble with attention when you were 6 or 7? I don't know, especially as an adult. Can anyone here provide any details about how you performed at age 7? I have no idea what was happening in my life at age. I don't even think, I'd have to think for a couple minutes to tell you where I lived at age 7. So if that's the case, technically, you couldn't make a diagnosis for the vast majority of people.
There is a cultural bias out there in terms of the schooling and what's expected of 7-year-olds. Because in grade 7-year-olds and 6-year-olds are expected to stay for an hour and look at a picture. And the way that they're being taught, you're really seeing attention there compared to preschool.
Yeah.
But in the States, it's a very different way of teaching, and of course, it's not going to be as sensitive. I'm not sure how.
And that's definitely true. It's not just a matter of what are this person's strengths and weaknesses, but it's where this person's strengths and weaknesses in comparison to what's being expected of them. And it's that fit that if you're able to sit and not move around, then you'll look pretty good. Now, you're not paying attention, but the teacher doesn't know it because you're not running around, you're not looking under your seat, and you're not talking to your neighbor. So some symptoms are much more obvious, and others are much less obvious. Yeah?
That is a little of the Greek system. It has become very clear to me that ADHD is revealed at high school, for sure.
Yeah.
It's the Greek system and the diversity of all the different subjects that the kids have to deal with. You can deny it until elementary school happily, especially because they have one teacher and you have a relationship with the teacher. The teacher hopefully supporting. But in high school, where you have all these different subjects, this is when it is revealed, and you cannot deny it anymore, especially because of exams and degrees.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, and that's true in the States as well. That if you're smart and nice, you can get away with it through elementary school. Because, when you're 10, there's a normal range of development. And the teacher will say, well, she doesn't pay attention very well, but she's only 9, so okay. you know, and mom and dad sit and they help the child do homework and they remind them to bring things to school and all of that. So that, it's within the, much more in the range of normal. And then when you get to be 15, it's not as much in the range of normal. And of course the expectations go way up. You have 7 teachers and we expect you to know the homework for all 7 classes. So it's a very different world for a 16-year-old. So just real quick, since they're in your handout and they're in the DSM anyway, just to kind of zip through. So in order to qualify on the inattentive side, you have to have 6 out of these 9. So often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or even in play activities. So, you know, the kid on the soccer field who's not paying attention to, you know, that guy's coming up on the side, you may want to move over there. Often doesn't seem to listen when spoken to directly. Often doesn't follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace. Now, this is not because they're being oppositional, and it's not because they didn't understand the directions. So it's not that simple. It's about, you know, somewhere between knowing what to do and doing it, things get off track. Often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. Often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, such as schoolwork or homework. Doesn't mean that they can't, but they would choose not to if they get the choice. Often loses things necessary for tasks or activities, is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, meaning the thing they're not supposed to be paying attention to, and is often forgetful in daily activities. So those are the 9. To qualify for ADHD, technically you need 6 of them, at least 6. The hyperactive impulsive side, again, it's 6 out of 9, but these are put together, so there's 9 in total for both. Often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in seat. Often leaves seat in classroom or in other situations in which remaining seated is expected. Often runs about or climbs excessively in situations in which it's appropriate. Now, no adult does that. You know, you'll never have an adult coming in and complaining about how their spouse is climbing the tree in the backyard. So instead, it may be limited to subjective feelings of restlessness. So they could sit still, but they would rather not. Often has difficulty playing or engaging in leisure activities quietly, so things are much noisier. And is often on the go or acts as if driven by a motor. Go, go, go. Lots of energy. Often talks excessively. For girls, this is, you'll see a little bit more of this instead of the other hyperactive impulsives. Talk, 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 talk.
Before you go into impulsivity, the one that you were laughing about, the climbing trees, wouldn't one say that they engage more often in high-risk activities?
Yes.
I mean, as adults?
Kids with ADHD wind up in the emergency room more often than kids without ADHD.
I'm saying with adults.
Right. And with adults it'll show up in other ways. So other thrill-seeking behaviors. So impulsivity, again, there's 6 hyperactivity, there's only 3 impulsivity. If you need 6 out of 9, it's really hard to get 6 out of 9 as an adult, even if you really have ADHD. Often blurts out answers before questions have been completed, so they interrupt. Often has difficulty waiting their turn. They tend to kind of want to jump ahead. So the drivers who are, you know, cutting you off maybe. Often interrupts or intrudes on others. So butts into conversations or games. So they don't, sort of the boundaries there, the social boundaries, they tend to sort of push into because they don't want to wait. Where something is said and they go, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, or that's exciting. In they go. Yeah. And some of this is a cultural thing, you know, that we need to compare someone within the culture, because if the culture suggests a certain amount of this, then that's going to look one way. Whereas, you know, my mother is Swedish, so if you're in Sweden, you know, normal Swedes, normal Greeks, they don't look the same. So, you know, in that case, you're going to stand out more if you have ADHD, if you live in Sweden, than if you're here in Greece. So yeah, absolutely, we need to take the cultural aspects into account as well. So there are 3 subtypes of ADHD. One is the primarily inattentive, so not a whole lot of hyperactive impulsive symptoms. This is often called ADD. Technically, it's ADHD, predominantly inattentive type. Second type is primarily hyperactive impulsive. So not really inattentive, but just hyperactive impulsive. And then the third type is combined, meaning inattentive and also hyperactive impulsive. The pure hyperactive impulsive probably doesn't exist, because mostly this is given to young kids who are clearly hyperactive, but have not yet reached an age that we expect attention. Give them a few years, they'll show the inattention, and then they'll qualify for the combined type. So really what we have is the two, inattentive and the combined.
Isn't some types continuing in adulthood as well, or do they start during?
Well, and that's a good question. That, you know, if you were hyperactive as a kid, you're probably not hyperactive as an adult, so that part fades away. According to Barkley, his feeling is if you used to qualify for the combined type when you were a kid, but you're not hyperactive today, you're still combined type. Because there's some different things going on neurologically between just inattentive versus also hyperactive. So, so the technical diagnosis would still be combined type. So the question that we face as clinicians, but also as car mechanics, is the problem ADHD, or is it instead something else, or is it actually both? What better explains the difficulties that this person is having? If it's an adult, there's a good chance that there's probably some other diagnosis there as well. And maybe not a full diagnosis, so they don't technically meet criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, but they sure lean that way. So maybe they don't hit, I don't know what the numbers are, but you know, let's say 7 out of 10, maybe they only hit 5, but they're anxious enough that it's making their life less enjoyable. So, as we said, the hyperactivity changes over time. It tends to fade away. But the world changes also. The world of a 10-year-old is very different than the world of a 30-year-old. So the good news is, as an adult, you have a lot of ways to earn a living and to live your life. Whereas as a kid, school pretty much looks like school regardless of the school that you go to. Some are a little different, but still, it's classrooms, it's homework, it's all the same in that kind of way. But for adults, there's a million ways that you can live your life. So you can create a situation or find a situation that fits your strengths better and hopefully doesn't hit too much on your weaknesses. So we have more flexibility as adults. Now the bad news is when you're a child or a teen, it's okay for someone else to pay attention for you and remind you about stuff and organize your things and all of that. As you become an adult, now you're supposed to be doing that. So the struggles become potentially more problematic. So one of the things that came out of the Barkley-Fisher, or the Barkley-Murphy and Fisher book, they did this gigantic analysis. They looked at 100 different possible symptoms to find which are the criteria that best distinguish ADHD from everything else. And not just ADHD from not ADHD, because you can do that in one question. Do you have trouble paying attention? And if someone does not have ADHD and doesn't have any other diagnosable condition, that one question will separate out ADHD from not ADHD. But here's the problem. Someone who has no diagnosable condition does not call your office. By definition, if someone calls your office, something is going on. Because if people are doing well, they don't call your office and pay you 100 euros or whatever so they can come and brag about how awesome things are going in their life. And if they do, then they're probably narcissistic and then there is something going on. So instead, we need some way to separate out ADHD from anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, substance abuse, sleep problems, everything else in the DSM. So what Barkley and his colleagues did was they looked at 100 different criteria, and they did all these awful statistics, so we don't have to do them, and they found out these next criteria are much better than the DSM criteria at separating out ADHD. Some of them come from the DSM, a few of them. Some of them come from other places. So, number one is often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli or irrelevant thoughts. So in other words, it's not just noise out here. We can be distracted by our own thoughts as well. Often makes decisions impulsively. So we're seeing more weighting on the impulsive side here. Weighting as in they put more weight onto it. Often has difficulty stopping his or her activities or behavior when he or she should do so. In other words, hyperfocus. So it's poor attention regulation. Often starts a project or task without reading or listening to directions carefully. So again, impulsive. Often shows poor follow-through on promises or commitments he or she may make to others. This is a perspective memory thing. When we talk about executive functions, or if you're in some of my prior lectures or last night's lecture, you know what perspective memory is. Often has trouble doing things in their proper order or sequence. This is a working memory thing. Again, one of the executive functions. You have to remember all the steps and keep it in mind while you're working your way through. Often more likely to drive a motor vehicle much faster than others, excessive speeding. Again, every Greek, I think, is going to hit this one. Although I was in Istanbul a few days ago, they're all going to hit that one, except when they're stuck in horrible traffic, in which case no one drives well, but no one's obeying the traffic laws there either, so that's like a whole other world over there. Now, just to show how detailed these guys are, not every adult drives. So if you don't drive, you're already at a disadvantage in terms of, because you're one short. This criteria doesn't apply if you don't drive. So if you don't drive, the substitute item is often has difficulty engaging in leisure activities or doing fun things quietly. So that one came out of the DSM. That one actually turned out to be a good one. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. That's also from the DSM. And then also from the DSM, the last one, often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities. These are better than the DSM. They're more accurate at separating out people who really do have ADHD from those who don't. And the reason is that, like we said, adults who, or kids who definitely have ADHD, the older they get, they fit the criteria less and less well. And the reason they fit them less well is not because they cease to have ADHD, because they continue to have all the same struggles, but it's because the DSM isn't good at picking up this adults as they are at picking up kids.
Could you just qualify the first one a bit more? Often has difficulty engaging in leisure activities or doing fun things quietly. It seems like two different things. Can you just give us some examples of
They are two different things. So what they did was they found the top 9, and this was number 10. So they're completely different. But you know, when they did their analysis of all 100, they took the ones that were most predictive, that did the best job at saying ADHD, not ADHD. It's helpful, like I said, to look at report cards or to ask a parent or the person themselves, what have the teachers been saying over the years? And these are the comments that are most telling in terms of ADHD. So someone who has ADHD is going to get a lot of these kind of comments. Could do better, needs to put in more effort, homework is missing, that's a big one. If someone does all of their homework without mom or dad sitting down with them to do it, probably ADHD is not the right diagnosis. It may be, but probably not. Disruptive in class, that's more the hyperactive impulsive. Someone is inattentive, they're not paying attention, but they're not causing a problem. Disorganized, so their backpack is a mess, their binders, their desk, their locker. Or sloppy, the work is sloppy and they rush too much. So they rush through, so their handwriting is bad, they don't read all the directions and read the second half of the question, do this, but also then do that. But definitely, the hyperactive impulsive stuff is easy to see. I used this line yesterday, but Tom Brown, who's written a number of books about ADHD, has a great line where he says, the school janitor can diagnose the hyperactive kids because they make themselves known. Inattentive kids don't make themselves known in the same kind of way. They're quieter about the struggles that they're having. Especially if you're smart, especially if you're likable. You can kind of float by. And if you're a boy, then it's one of those things like, oh, you know, some boys, they just, you know, they don't like school or something, and that's it. Okay, well then we don't need to do anything about it, do we? So, I'm going to talk about bipolar disorder and substance abuse in terms of how do you separate out, is this ADHD or is it bipolar? Because these look a little bit more similar compared to anxiety and depression, which has a whole different feel. So, on the surface, folks with ADHD and folks with bipolar disorder both have trouble.
What bipolar disorder is for some people?
Like manic depression. So, and especially, you know, people with bipolar 1 who have big manic episodes. So they're the ones who think they're Jesus and they write, you know, a 200-page letter to the president to, I figured out the, you know, debt crisis problem, and, you know, big manic episodes. Those are easy to diagnose because clearly that's a manic episode. It's more the bipolar 2. So it's not big manic episodes, it's hypomanic episodes and depressive episodes. Those are a little bit harder to tell from ADHD. But you'll see trouble with spending money, with sleep, with energy level, and with talkativeness. But they're completely different. That if all you ask is, you have trouble with spending money? Yes. You have trouble with sleep? Yes. Okay, well then it's bipolar or it's ADHD or it's both. You need to get into the details. So, someone with ADHD, well, someone with bipolar disorder spends money normally as well or as badly as anybody else until they hit a hypomanic episode. And then their spending goes boom, way up. And they spend big amounts of money on things. Someone with ADHD, it's more a constant dribbling out of money. So, they don't have time to make lunch, so they're forced to buy lunch. They go to the grocery store to buy 2 things, they wind up buying 4 things, and hope maybe only one of the things they're supposed to, and 3 other things. Or they go to the store and they see something, and say, oh, that's really cool, I'm going to buy that. So in little ways, they spend too much money. Whereas bipolar is fine, boom, a big way, or a big amount of spending. A lot of adults with ADHD also have trouble with sleep. They don't get enough sleep, partially because it's hard to wind down, to get into bed, dark room, and just lie there and try not to think. So, or they get into bed late because they're having fun. They're doing something enjoyable, or they're catching up on finishing the laundry or loading the dishwasher or whatever. So it cuts into their sleep. They probably need that normal amount of sleep, although a lot of adults with ADHD I have seem to do pretty good on less sleep. And I'm really jealous and I hate them for that, because I wish I could get by on the less sleep that they get by on. But as opposed to someone who's having a hypomanic episode, normally they need 6, 7, 8 hours, but then they go through a period of time where they can do good on 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and not just that sort of I have to study for my final exams kind of, I don't get enough sleep. But they actually have more energy despite getting less sleep. So the details are very different in terms of sleep. A lot of the folks who used to be hyperactive as a kid are not running around, but they may have a lot more energy. So they might work 2 jobs, or they work a job and then they play a sport and they're running and they're just busy and they're always moving, they don't sit still. It can look like a bit of a manic kind of energy, except it's not up and down, up and down, up and down. It's always there. It's just kind of constant through life. But someone, a psychiatrist might put them on a mood stabilizer, which doesn't do anything, or a psychologist says, this sounds kind of bipolar, and they refer for a mood stabilizer, which doesn't do anything. And then the talkativeness as well, kind of related to the energy, that for ADHD it's more of a constant thing, whereas for bipolar it's more in a manic episode that they talk, and they can't get the words out, and pressured speech, they have too many ideas, and they can't get them out quick enough. So do you see that difference between bipolar and ADHD?
So if someone is diagnosed as bipolar 2 and gets on meds and they work with the depression side, does that mean that he didn't have ADD, or could he still be depressive and ADD and get bipolar medication and feel better in terms of his...
Well, and it's possible to have both as well.
Yeah.
And it's a strange thing that having bipolar disorder makes you more likely to have ADHD, especially the earlier the bipolar manifests itself. Having ADHD doesn't make you more likely to have bipolar disorder. So the higher prevalence only goes one direction, not both directions. So, you know, it's not good practice to make diagnoses by medication response. Well, we'll try you on this, and if it works, then you have that, and if it doesn't, then you don't. But there are times when you do address the first thing, whatever you think that is, and then you see what's left. You know, and there are times where that is what we need to do. It's not the best practice, but sometimes that's as good as it's going to get.
Do you know statistics of how often bipolar goes with ADHD?
Well, you know, in the study earlier it said 20%, give or take. But again, it said people with bipolar are more likely to have ADHD. So,
one
yeah.
point is mood swings. Those are the problems of night class. ADHD patients also have mood swings.
Yeah.
That are short swings back.
Right.
And on the other hand, bipolar or borderline kind of bipolar, so
Yeah.
have different kinds of mood swings. That's my important one.
Right. So the comment here is about mood swings, and actually I really should add that to my slide. And when we talk about emotional self-control in the executive functions, we're going to talk about that. So, but that's an excellent point. That kind of the very quick difference is someone with ADHD will have a quick emotional response, and then it comes quick and it goes away quick too. If you leave them alone, it'll fade out pretty quickly, as for most people. Someone with bipolar disorder, they'll have a quick mood spike or a strong feeling, and it will tend to persist longer, even in the absence of somebody fueling it. So if you're fighting with someone, you're arguing with them, that keeps the emotion going. Whereas if you leave them in an empty room, it should fade away. Someone who's bipolar, someone who has a borderline personality is more likely to keep that emotion raging for a longer period of time. So yeah, definitely. And certainly someone with a borderline personality, they're going to have a lot of inconsistency and chaos and disruption in their life as well. But it's probably going to be more tied to relationships and things of that sort rather than in a more global sense, like ADHD. And you just get a different feel from someone with a borderline personality. So the next thing we're going to take a look at here is ADHD versus substance abuse. So adults with ADHD, teens with ADHD, are more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs. They're also more likely to start these things at an earlier age than teens without ADHD. But then it creates a problem. Is it you don't pay attention well because you have ADHD, or is it because you've been smoking pot every day for the last 6 years? Because, by the way, that's certainly going to affect your attention. So in those cases, sometimes what you need to do is say, okay, let's talk about times that you weren't smoking a lot of pot. And not like 3 days, but some months where you weren't. How did you do then? Or before you started smoking, how are you doing at that point? That's hard, especially if you have someone who's been smoking pot or drinking heavily or whatever for 10 years, 20 years. And besides the fact that if someone's been doing that, probably their self-reporting is not the most accurate, which is at those times you really want to have a second person along. And as much as I hate to say it, there are times where someone needs to be clean for a period of some months before you can get a sense of what's going on. The irony is, if you don't address their ADHD, it's going to be harder for them to be less impulsive, harder for them to have their life going in a good way so they don't have to self-medicate. So it becomes this like you're kind of stuck both ways.
If it's not a long-term use though, abuse, I hear very often from adults and with the patients and with friends that have ADHD that when they do drugs or drink alcohol, they concentrate a lot more.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of stimulant as well, I'm assuming.
And actually, the most common drug of abuse among adults with ADHD is the same as it is for everybody else, which is marijuana. I mean, the most common is alcohol, but once you put that aside, it's marijuana. And I have heard a lot of people say that, I smoke pot and then I can pay attention better. My sense of it is that it quiets the anxiety, and it's the anxiety that's causing additional, poor concentration. So it does work in some sort of way. I mean, if it didn't work in any way, you wouldn't do it. By definition, you only do something that provides some benefit. Now, it provides more negatives, but you don't take that into account when you're doing it. So yeah, I think that is a pretty common thing. So in terms of gender differences, we'll just do a few more slides and then we'll take a quick break. According to the DSM, there are somewhere from 4 times more boys than girls to 9 times more boys than girls. Probably that's an overestimation. Probably the truth is closer to 50-50 or maybe 2 to 1. But again, boys are more likely to be hyperactive. That makes them obvious. We tend to think if a boy comes in or a man comes in, we're more likely to think ADHD than if a woman or a girl comes in. So again, you find what you're looking for. Probably, when a teenage girl comes in and she's not doing well in school and she's not doing well with friends and she's anxious and depressed, more likely it's going to be diagnosed as anxiety and depression, which is indeed there. But that's not the cause, that's the end result. So let's take, 5-minute break or so, kind of stretch our legs. You can go, use the restroom, grab a cookie, grab a smoke, and then we'll come back and we'll talk some more. Going again. My feet are very happy to have a chair, so that's a good thing. Is there a question?
Yes, before we go on, I was wondering about another factor. It's actually in the broader sense. What about ADHD versus neglect? What I'm saying is, because you mentioned before, people who grew up in the 70s or in the early 80s and have not been diagnosed. Back then, a lot of parents have been maybe influenced by a pseudo-liberal approach that we let the kids, and they would found themselves, maybe this had its merits. But I think that, for whatever reasons, there are kids who have never been taught how to get down, how to study, how to write a proper homework, and whether this is the job of the parent or not, this is another question, but some basic things, at least, again, in the Greek system, they are required from the parent. What factors do you think, and even in other cases, worst cases of that, when in homes where kids have been very disorganized, and look at the culture of the house.
Right.
But not necessarily, how do we distinguish this, on the neurological basis of ADHD, with a culture of laissez-faire, neglect, or you name it?
It's a good question because, we're a product not only of what our genes, how our genes drive our neurological development, but also of the way that we're raised. And what skills are we taught and what skills are we not taught, and what habits are acceptable or not acceptable. So absolutely, that will have an effect on someone as well, whether they have ADHD or not. My thought would be that the pattern of troubles would look a little bit different in a household of neglect compared to a household or compared to a situation where someone actually has ADHD proper. So that the person may have certain kind of difficulties, but they're going to look a little bit different. But if during an interview you're hearing a lot of this other stuff going on, then yeah, absolutely, you're going to be you're going to need to explore that a little bit more to see if that seems to explain what's going on with this person, as opposed to being more of a true ADHD kind of thing going on.
Does that have implications for the treatment?
Yeah, that if it's simply a matter of...
Because the end result might be, it might be that, again, a pattern of disorganization and tension.
In some ways, you might judge you might base the treatment based on the response. That if you teach strategies and you work on coping skills and other things of that sort, if it works and it does the job, then maybe you think, okay, this is more the person never learned it in the first place. Whereas if it's not sticking, that it works for a few days, but then it sort of falls off, then maybe you begin to think, okay, this looks more like ADHD, rather than simply not having learned the skills. But, you know, if someone is being raised, especially by a single parent who has ADHD, and they have trouble with being organized in scheduling and things of that sort, they didn't learn it at home either. Now, maybe they learned it at school, maybe they learned it from a coach in sports, or from a friend's parent, or something. So maybe they got it somewhere else. But, you know, it's that thing, however you grow up, that's normal. So, so yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing. I mean, this is why we go to graduate school for a long time to learn this stuff. This is why we hopefully spend a couple hours to really look at the details and figure it out. And I think that a lot of the overdiagnosis is happening by people not spending enough time, and it's quick to make that diagnosis. And, you know, but then you don't get it right if you don't spend the time.
Two scales to this question. So to add a question on what you were just saying, so if a child that is raised in a structural environment, an ADHD child is raised in a structural environment, does he or she have more chances of learning, at least, as a learning ability, have to be more structural, fighting for ADHD, of course, is my first question. Yeah,
I would expect if you grow up in a structured home, or at least you have one structured parent, then you probably have the skills, at least in theory. In terms of applying them consistently, that's where the ADHD comes in. But at least they have the basics of it, they know it.
So then again, if they're early diagnosed, and you work on it consistently, so if you have a child that's 8 or 9 or 10 years old, diagnosed with ADHD, and you do work on it consistently until they're 18 or 20, then this child has more of the chances as an adult to work more structured within the problem, of course, within the situation, than a child that doesn't.
I would expect, yeah, that someone who's diagnosed at 8 or 9 and strategies are applied in treatment and parents are involved in the right kind of ways and all that, I would expect them to have a different life path than someone who gets diagnosed at 30.
And do they have a less of a chance of going into medical treatment?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, to the extent that the strategies work, then yeah, maybe they don't need medication as likely. So, one more question, and then we'll kind of move on, and then we'll definitely have time for questions at the break and at the end.
It's related to your question, because I'm wondering how much the diagnosis would actually interfere with consistent application of the treatment. Would they stay in treatment for so long, or consistently? Because you know, the parents are not following up and so on.
Right. And that is one of the challenges, that, you know, most kids do well with consistency, kids with ADHD especially, but if a parent has ADHD, probably undiagnosed, untreated, then it does create this situation where they're less able to do the things that ideally they would. So there's no easy answer to that, other than perhaps the parent also needs to work on some. Because the better the parents do, the better the kids do in every house. So let's talk about the executive functions to sort of understand a little bit better why it is that people with ADHD have the specific troubles that they do. So the challenge for all of us every moment of the day is to take a look at what are all the things going on around us at this moment. What is most important for me to pay attention to versus what are the things that are less important. In order to do that, we need to not just consider the present moment, but we also need to look back on the lessons of the past to teach us what is most important in this moment. But we also need to project forward into time to figure out what needs to happen when, what is more important, what are the different scenarios, and we can mentally play that out before we actually do it. So there's a lot that happens moment by moment by moment as we go through our days. The executive functions are some of our highest order cognitive processes that they enable us to sort through all the information going on around us and to apply basically to apply what we know. That they enable us to convert our intentions into actions. So, you know, we talked about how people with ADHD, they know what to do, but they don't necessarily do it in a consistent kind of way, and it's executive functions that are responsible for that. That the executive functions mostly work pretty well, except for the times that they don't. And in order to make the best decision in the moment, it requires us to not simply to respond to whatever's going on around us. That responding to whatever is right in front of you, if you respond to that, then you can't think about the bigger picture. So if your friend calls you up and says, hey, do you want to come out and do something fun? If you say, yes, that's much more interesting than my homework, you're not going to create a better future for yourself. Or if you would rather, surf the internet rather than work on that report you need to for work, the internet might be more fun, but the report is the better thing for your future in terms of your job and otherwise. So the executive functions are a lot about creating a better future for ourselves. So I'm going to just do a quick summary of 6 of the executive functions that we're going to talk about that are most related to ADHD. I'll do a quick summary here, and then we'll get into more detail, but this way you have kind of a big picture of what we're talking about. So the first executive function is what's called working memory. So this is the ability to take information in, do something with it, process, hold it on deck, pull information out of long-term memory, and either transfer into long-term memory or generate a response. Working memory and attention work very closely together. In other words, working memory stores what we're paying attention to. Next executive function is called the sense of time, and this is basically the ability to be aware of time, to mentally track time, to plan your activities in relation to time. What do you do when? How long is it going to take? How long do you have until the next thing needs to happen? Perspective memory is, it's basically a mental to-do list. So it's the ability to remember, to take an idea from this moment in time and carry it forward to a future moment in time. So in other words, when I'm done here, I need to remember to unplug my computer and make sure that the little adapter plug from the US plug to the European plug, that comes with me. So that's in my perspective memory. At 5 o'clock or 5:30, I need to take that with me. The next executive function, this is very much related to the question about emotional regulation, is emotional self-control. So the ability to change the intensity of what we're feeling. So to either feel more or often to feel less. Folks with ADHD tend to feel their emotions more strongly, which has a greater effect on what they think and then on what they do. Next executive function is called self-activation. It's the ability to get ourselves up and moving on something before the last minute. And usually this refers to something not interesting. Things that are fun don't take a lot of self-activation. It's the boring stuff that takes self-activation. And then finally, related executive functions that I put together, hindsight and forethought. So hindsight is looking back into your past to draw lessons to use in the present. And forethought is the ability to think forward into the future about likely scenarios so you can make the right choice at the right moment. So the executive functions explain a whole lot of what we need to know about ADHD. They explain why people with ADHD have certain kinds of struggles, but they don't have other struggles. So what makes, in other words, what makes ADHD ADHD? So why is it not OCD? Why is it not bipolar? Why is it not Asperger's? Why is it not something else? It also explains why some strategies are very effective for adults, or for people with ADHD, and other strategies are not effective. So remember that strategy of, you have trouble getting places on time? You should leave earlier. Is not a good strategy for ADHD. What is a good strategy is setting an alarm that tells you it's now time to leave. And that relates to the executive function of sense of time. If you're not aware of it, if you don't track time well and you don't know what time it is, it's hard to know what that leave on time thing actually is. They also explain why some treatments are effective for ADHD, but other treatments are not effective. So for example, the stimulants increase activity in the part of the brain involved in response inhibition and involved in the executive function. So the stimulants work very well for ADHD. the SSRI antidepressants do not increase activity in that part of the brain. They increase activity in other parts of the brain, but not the parts that are involved in executive functions. So the SSRIs do nothing at all for ADHD. But most important for us as clinicians, or for someone with ADHD, the executive functions explain why someone had the troubles that they did over the years. So why, despite good effort, and despite good intentions, did certain things work out the way that they did. But even more important, by understanding the executive functions, we can offer a better future. We can help someone with ADHD close that gap between intentions and actions, so they do the stuff that they know to do and that they want to do. And that's really the thing that matters the most. It's about creating a better future. So, having said that, we all have our moments. Nobody's perfect. Everyone loses their keys sometimes. The question is how often and for how long. If it's, once in a blue moon, you lose it for a couple minutes, that's annoying, but that's not ADHD. So we all have our moments where our executive functions are imperfect. And there's certainly a lot of other things separate from ADHD that can affect our executive functions. So stress, definitely, being preoccupied by other things, having too many things on your mind, will reduce how well your executive functions work. So will sleep deprivation, whether for one night or a bunch of nights in a row, if you have a newborn who's keeping you awake. Anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, substance abuse. Again, these will reduce how well your executive functions work. And unfortunately, so will aging. Not in your 30s so much, but a little bit in your 40s, more in your 50s, more in your 60s, more in your 70s. Unfortunately, women worse than men during the kind of menopause time. So during that time when your hormones are kind of going all over the place, you're going to feel all of a sudden like, wow, I can't remember anything anymore. Or boy, is my attention a whole lot more unfocused than it used to be. But that's not ADHD. That's just, it's kind of like for executive functions to work well, a lot of things need to work well. If they're working badly, there's a lot of different reasons why they're working badly. Unfortunately, there's a momentum effect here that if because of their ADHD, they have trouble keeping their stuff organized, planning out their time well, following the time, sticking through on things that are not very interesting, it creates a certain amount of clutter and disorganization in their life. That is harder to deal with than if their life were more structured and ordered. So if you have a lot of stuff out on the table near the front door, you have 4 days worth of mail, you have your kid's backpack, you have a bunch of other things, that really important thing that you need to bring tomorrow with you to work that you put there, it's going to be that much harder to see and that much harder to remember. As opposed to if that table on the front door has only your keys and wallet and cell phone and nothing else, and you put that really important envelope there, it stands out. You'll say, oh right, got to bring the envelope. So unfortunately, it creates a situation where because of the executive functioning difficulties, things just get worse and worse. They get more and more complicated. That's the bad news. The good news of it is if we can work with our clients and find ways to create more structure and order in their life, it reduces the burden on their executive function. It doesn't make the executive functions work better necessarily, it just reduces the demands so they function better, if that makes sense. It's kind of like if I don't have my contacts in, if I'm sitting in the back of the room, I can't read that. If I move to the front row, now I can read it. My eyes are no better, but I can see what I need to see because I'm closer to it. It's that same kind of an idea. Because folks with ADHD struggle with keeping track of all these things and organizing their life, other people tend to step in more. And if you're a kid, that's okay because that's what's supposed to happen with kids. As you become a teen, you probably don't like other people getting into your business. And when you're an adult, maybe you're a little bit more accepting of it, or at least less defiant, but you still don't like it very much. And the person doing the stepping in probably doesn't like it a whole lot either, although they do kind of like being able to, have it their way of how things get done. But other people step in, and that's a real double-edged sword. alternatively, people will use other things to do the executive functioning. So people who live and die by their smartphone, you know, people who say, man, I have everything in here. I put everything into my phone, I have my to-do list, I have my calendar, I have my reminders, I do my banking online, I do all, you know, that smartphone is an external executive function. And that works. So if it works, then do it. And then don't lose your phone. So, when it comes to the executive functions, Barkley has what he's called the response inhibition theory of ADHD. As far as I'm concerned, this is the best theory out there in terms of explaining ADHD. I've seen him present a number of times on his new model of executive functions. In his book, he has a brand new book that like literally just came out. It's probably sitting on my, you know, doorstep now, back home. Like I ordered it and it's probably sitting in the mailbox right now. But the idea is that there's a space that in order for the executive functions to work, we need to open up a space between stimulus and response. That if a stimulus occurs and you react to it immediately, then there's no time to think and to make that better informed, more thought out choice. So it's in that space between stimulus and response that the executive functions operate. So the problem for folks with ADHD is that they don't open up that space as reliably. So stimulus occurs, they respond too quick. So they're sitting at work and they're working on something, there's some noise back there, and they turn to it, they respond to the stimulus before they think and say, you know, in a split second, they say, nah, that's not, I don't need, whatever, forget that. And they mentally kind of push it away so they can keep their attention on the thing that they're doing. So, so let's talk a little bit more about it. Hopefully that will kind of make sense. Unfortunately, the stimuli that are most important to pay attention to are not necessarily the stimuli that pull hardest at our attention. Often it's quite the opposite. The distractions are stimuli that are very interesting, but are probably not important. So a student sitting in class, the kid next to you who's talking, maybe not to you, but to the kid next to him, that's very interesting. And their attention goes there because they can't mentally kind of separate that out, rather than keeping their attention on the teacher, which is much more important. So, the first executive function here is working memory. And hopefully as we talk through this, this will make a little bit more sense in terms of the response inhibition part. So, working memory is not long-term memory, so not the part of our memory that remembers, you know, what street did you live on when you were a kid and other things like that, but working memory is like the RAM in your computer. So it's not the hard drive, it's the part of your computer that processes things in the moment. So our working memory takes information in, moment by moment, it takes information in, holds onto it, puts things together to make meaning of it. So as I'm speaking word after word after word, you're assembling those words into an idea. And then you hold that idea and you hear more words and you build another idea and then you connect those ideas. Oh, this is like that. Now I understand it. Once we have it in our working memory, we then transfer it into long-term memory. So here's something I read, here's something I heard, file that away. Or we generate a response. So working memory is like, I think of it as, it's kind of like a pipe and there's water running through it. Water comes in and we process it, ideas, stimuli, thoughts come in, process it, hold it, but there's constantly this flow of new ideas. So as I'm talking, these words are being replaced by the next words, the next words, the next words. And it's that flow of information that is constantly running through our working memory. So this creates a situation where, like I said, working memory holds what we're paying attention to. So working memory and attention, in some ways, are kind of the same thing, or at least they function in the same sort of way, or they function as one item. People with ADHD are more likely to have new stimuli come in and knock out of working memory the prior stimuli. So, you know, your husband says, oh, remember, you know, tonight, I don't know, the neighbors are going to stop by. Okay, but you're in the middle of making breakfast and one of the kids is talking to you, so the information comes in, the neighbors are stopping by, it comes into working memory, but then your child asks a question or you're burning the eggs and you jump to that, the new information comes in, knocks that idea out of working memory. So it never gets transferred back into long-term memory, which creates a rather unenjoyable moment of revelation later that night when the neighbors show up and the kitchen is still a disaster because you forgot that they were coming. Or, so either like that, or listening in a lecture, reading in a book, taking information and transferring it into long-term memory. Or if you have something and you put it down and you say, all right, I'm going to put this here and I'm going to get my keys and then I'm going to leave. So you find your keys, you have your keys, and ideally in working memory you're still holding, that's there, remember to get that before you leave. But the process of finding your keys knocks that idea out of working memory. So the thing gets left behind. So things get put down but they don't get remembered where they got placed. So that's how it affects ADHD. We're going to talk a little bit later when we get into the coaching section on, therefore, what are the, if these are the problems, what are the strategies that are effective? Take this executive function into account so that people with ADHD can be more consistent and more effective. The next executive function here involves what's called the sense of time. So it's the ability to be aware of time, to track time, to know what time it is, how much longer until, you know, I'm doing this, in 10 minutes I need to get up and go to the meeting, but I need to do this, I'm going to do a few more things. Okay, how long has it been? It's been about 6 minutes. How long has it been? It's been about 8 minutes. How long has it been? You know what, it's time to go. So tracking time and planning what you're doing in relation to time. Because folks with ADHD tend to lose track of time, they tend to either run late because they don't plan time ahead, or they don't realize they're doing whatever they're doing, they don't realize, oh my God, I should have left 10 minutes ago. So deadlines get missed, they run late, or they get focused in on whatever it is that they're doing that's interesting, they lose track of the time. And then too much time gets spent on that, and then they need to stay up late to finish what they needed to do, or they need to stay later at work to finish what they needed to do. So it has kind of consequences that spill forward. Perspective memory is, you know, like I said before, it's kind of that mental to-do list. It's the ability to remember to do what you need to do. Now, sometimes perspective memory involves, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 seconds. So it's those quick little things that, you know, does anyone like put something down to get something out of their pocket and then they left it there? Like, is there anyone that's never ever happened to, where you say, oh, I'm going to do this, but I'm just, really quick, I'm just going to check that. I'm just going to check the forecast. Okay, let's see what the forecast is, and then I'm going to come back and finish this. Check the forecast, and then your email pops up, and you say, oh, let me go, you know, and we get pulled in. And that's a perspective memory failure, that you lost that idea, I'm only doing this, and then I need to do that. Or if you burn something on the stove because you were said, oh, that looks like, all right, in 3 minutes I got to come back and check it. Perspective memory is used in that. As much as it's really helpful to have a to-do list where you write things down, you can't write down every single thing that you do, because then you spend all your time writing and no time actually doing. So that's why perspective memory is such an important skill to have, especially as an adult in this world. So when it comes to perspective memory, sometimes the trigger is a time. So in other words, I have a 3 o'clock appointment, I need to leave at 2:30. 2:30 is the time. Or company's coming over at 6, I need to put this in the oven at 5. But sometimes the trigger is not a time, but it's an event or it's a place. So when I get to the office, I have to remember, I have to go and I need to go into that pile. I need to look for that whatever it is. I need to get that book and I need to put it in my bag to take home. So that only counts when I'm at the office. In the car, it doesn't count, because the book that I need at the office is not in the car, so I can't act on it in the car. So because folks with ADHD have trouble with this, some of the places, or some of the ways that this plays out in life is they do the right thing, but they don't do it at the right time. So they remember too late, or after the ideal moment, now is the time I should do this. So, you know, to buy concert tickets, or to buy airline tickets, or to go to the bank or the post office, that they don't remember it at the right time, and then they have to do it later, or perhaps it's not just later, but it's tomorrow or next week, because things have kind of rolled away from them. On the social side of it, if you tend to forget to do the things that other people want you to do, there are social repercussions. That people see you, if you're forgetful, people will begin to see you as irresponsible, unfortunately. It's seen as, it's not that you forgot, it's that it wasn't important to you, and that's why you forgot. So people read intention into what we do. Does this sound familiar? Like when you think of ADHD, does this sort of fit? And like we said, in the new diagnostic criteria, some of these executive functions very much are showing up in those new criteria. So there's that convergence, there's an overlap.